My paper is titled The Cult Scare and the Shifting Politics of American Religious Freedom from 1975 to 1985, and where Jim focused on the anti-cult movement and how they are using the language of religious freedom. I'm really thinking more about those who are defending new religious movements in that period, including some members of those groups themselves, especially in this case the Unification Church, but also their allies and who functioned as their allies in this period and how that shifted over time. So the Reverend Donald Sills, who was a Southern Baptist minister and the president of a group called the Coalition for Religious Freedom, traveled the country in 1986 and 1987, leading workshops with right-wing political theorist W. Cleon Skousen in churches and public school classrooms from Alaska to Arizona. They distributed free copies of Skousen's textbook, The Making of America, along with a Bible supplement written by Sills. I don't know if any of you are familiar with these folks. Pretty big deal in the conservative religious right circles. Condemning what they saw as the dangerously secularized mainstream version of U.S. history, they presented evidence that the nation and its political system were grounded historically and necessarily in Christianity. Remember, they're speaking for a group called the Coalition for Religious Freedom. It may seem incongruous to some of you, along with the title of the group, that Sills and his Coalition for Religious Freedom were at the same time outspoken critics of anti-cult organizations such as the American Family Foundation and the Cult Awareness Network, the folks Jim was talking about. And they condemned the procedure of deprogramming advocated by these groups to reverse the mind control allegedly imposed by cults on their followers. Both Sills and Skousen had also spoken out on various occasions in support of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon and his controversial Unification Church, popularly known as the Moonies, a group derided by many Christians as a cult and a dangerous corruption of the Christian faith. This paper examines the shifting politics of religious freedom through the cult scare of the 70s and 80s, asking how the freedoms of the Unification Church and other new religious movements became a conservative Christian cause, at least for some conservative Christians like Sills and Skousen, and what this alliance suggests for the history of religious freedom in America. In many ways, it was a surprising convergence of interests. In the 1970s, it was civil libertarians like the ACLU and mainline Protestants who spoke out most vocally in defense of new religious movements, while both religious and political conservatives generally opposed such movements as threats to Christianity and or the social order. Not until the mid-1980s, when religious freedom really moved to the center as an organizing frame for evangelical concerns, did some conservative Christian leaders find common cause with the Unification Church and some other so-called cults. Both groups fought bitterly against what they experienced as a new level of state regulation. And here's my connection with Jenna's paper, as you'll see later, a little bit later. A regulatory regime that to them seemed designed to harass and destroy Christianity and perhaps all religion in America. The tentative alliance between some conservative evangelicals and the Unification Church in the 1980s and beyond, I should say, helps us understand the meaning and significance of religious freedom within the new religious right. Developments that have reshaped public and legal frameworks for religious freedom in late 20th century America. The profusion of new religious movements in the early 70s was in many ways a product of the intensities and the disillusionments of the late 1960s counterculture. Almost simultaneously, the anti-cult movement emerged as one dimension of a broader middle America backlash against that counterculture. And here's where I can cut out a whole paragraph because Jim already explained the dynamics of the anti-cult movement and how they're using the language of religious freedom. Denying that they had brainwashed anyone, the groups targeted as cults turned the tables by accusing deprogrammers of violating the religious liberties of adults who had freely chosen their faiths. The largest of the new religious movements, especially the Unification Church and the Church of Scientology, developed sophisticated public relations programs that insisted on their right to religious freedom. Deprogramming, this is a quote, deprogramming is a euphemism for what in fact is a very inhuman process constituting a serious infringement on the right of the church as guaranteed by the First Amendment, wrote Neil Salonen, president of the Unification Church in America in 1976. our members are not programmed to believe anything any more than any individual learns to value and be loyal to his faith in whatever church he belongs. A few of those liberated by the deprogrammers expressed gratitude for that service, but many quickly rejoined the movements from which they had been removed, and some filed charges of kidnapping and unlawful detention. Ted Patrick, the most controversial deprogrammer which you mentioned, was arrested and convicted several times on kidnapping charges, serving short prison terms in New York, Pennsylvania, California, and Colorado. The extremes of these deprogrammers created a degree of public sympathy, especially from civil libertarian and mainline Christian churches in the 70s for otherwise unpopular new religious movements. The National Council of Churches and the ACLU, among others, both issued strong statements rejecting deprogramming as a violation of civil and religious liberties and defending the religious legitimacy of the so-called cults. How was the state to determine the legitimacy of conversion or the validity of groups' method of evangelism? Asked Ira Glasser of the New York Civil Liberties Union. One ACLU report insisted that the new religious movements used methods of evangelism that would have been familiar to, quote, Jesus, Muhammad, Martin Luther, or Buddha. There were no criteria, in other words, that could differentiate them from the more established religious groups, and certainly not from the enthusiasm that had characterized virtually every religion in its early years. The anti-cult movement gained an unexpected boost with the tragedy of Jonestown in December 1978, when more than 900 members of the Radical People's Temple commune died in a mass suicide in rural Guyana. The covers of Time and Newsweek the next week famously depicted horrific scenes of bodies scattered around the Jonestown compound. And while some writers acknowledge that groups such as, quote, the Moonies, the Scientologists, or the Hare Krishnas were in no way guilty of the insanities of Jonesism, most coverage of the tragedy endorsed the premises of the anti-cult movement by associating only religious movements with the People's Temple as dangerous and threatening cults. Around the country, as Jim also discussed in more detail, state legislators considered bills aimed at controlling such groups. The IRS and other federal agencies were also investigating reports of fraud and financial mismanagement against the Unification Church, the Church of Scientology, and others, demanding their financial records and challenging their claims to tax-exempt status. 2 months after Jonestown, at the behest of anti-cult leaders, Senator Bob Dole, and this was also mentioned by Jim, but there's a few pieces from the hearing that I want to talk about in a little more detail. Dole convened an informal congressional hearing on the cult phenomenon in the United States. The anti-cult experts at the hearing included a staffer who had accompanied former Congressman Ryan to Jonestown. Ryan had been killed at Jonestown. Psychologists and popular writers on the phenomena of mind control and sudden personality change, allegedly brought on by cults, and a Catholic priest who argued that protecting the abuses of pseudo-religious cults, which he insisted were easily identified, in no way violated the freedoms of legitimate religions. Incidentally, I don't want to make this too long of a parenthetical, but there was also a Jewish rabbi who was very involved in a number of Jews who were very involved in the anti-cult movement, and so this was a point of intense debate within the American Jewish community at this time, because of course there were prominent Jews who were leaders in the civil liberties in the ACLU, like Glasser himself, who were very much defending the rights of new religious movements, others who claimed that the cults were specifically targeting Jews, and that this was a real danger for American Jews, and Jews tended to categorize Messianic Jewish movements also as cults. So the meaning of cults and the dangers of religious proselytization to American Judaism is an important issue for them. Those speaking in defense of new religious movements at Dole's hearing were clearly in the minority and procured invitations to speak very much at the last minute. They included representatives from the ACLU, the National Council of Churches, the Baptist Joint Committee on Public Affairs, which worked very much together with the ACLU at the time on most issues, and the United Church of Christ. Neil Salonen, the Unification Church in America president, who I quoted earlier, appeared at the hearing without an invitation and was reluctantly granted the right to speak, as well by Dole at the last minute. Salonen complained that his church was being unfairly targeted by anti-cult groups and offered a spirited defense of his church and its founder, the Reverend Moon. Salonen strategically linked the interests of his church to the principle of religious freedom more generally, arguing that the anti-cult movement was at heart anti-religious and was targeting a wider and wider circle of religious groups. Many of the so-called experts and deprogrammers, he noted, had used the charges of mental snapping and mind control to target, quote, born-again Christians, transcendental meditation, and Christians who receive the gift of tongues. So here's this is where you can see, Jenna's paper demonstrates breadth, some of the breadth and reach of state regulation that really was occurring at this time that formed the basis then of the beginnings of folks, some of the new religious movements and some evangelical Christians finding common interests against that kind of state regulation. Salonen was claiming a correspondence of interest with conservative evangelicals, but none of the latter spoke at the hearing on either side of the debate. Unification Church was looking for any allies it could find at this time. In the early 80s, these were still, for the most part, civil libertarians and mainline Christians. One legal battle involved the denial of tax-exempt status for Unification Church properties by the state of New York on the grounds that they were being used for political and economic rather than religious purposes. The National Council of Churches, the Catholic League for Civil and Religious Rights, the National Association of Evangelicals, also, which actually I would argue functioned in this case more as more in a mainline capacity than on the religious right end of things, but we can talk about that. And the American Jewish Congress all filed friend of the court briefs in the case, endorsing, quote, the rights of all churches to define their own religion as a critical dimension of religious freedom in America. And in June 1982, the New York State Court of Appeals ruled for the Unification Church in this case, finding that all its properties were integrally linked with the church's own conception of its religious mission and must therefore be granted the same tax exemption as any other recognized religious group. In other words, the court determined that it was not for the state to decide what was religious practice. In the initial trial and conviction of the Reverend Moon on federal charges of tax fraud and conspiracy, the Unification Church found fewer allies at this time. Mose Durst, who had replaced Salonen as president of the Unification Church in America, insisted that Moon had simply failed to pay taxes on church properties held in his name, none of them used for his personal benefit. This procedure, he argued, was no different from that of other religious leaders such as bishops of the Catholic Church. At a rally for religious freedom organized by the church in October 1981 to protest Moon's arraignment, Reverend Moon himself presented his trial as a new episode in America's long history of racial and religious persecution. I would not be standing here today if my skin were white and my religion Presbyterian, he told the crowd. I'm here today only because my skin is yellow and my religion is Unification Church. Here and on other occasions, Moon identified his church with the hallowed cause of the civil rights movement. I will fight for my last breath for religious liberty and the rights of minorities and the oppressed. He proclaimed we must win together so that our children can live in a land of true freedom and true equality, what Dr. Martin Luther King called the promised land. On this occasion, however, he found little sympathy from civil rights activists, civil libertarians, evangelicals, or anyone else, and the U.S. District Court found him guilty of conspiracy and tax fraud, and he was sentenced the next summer to 18 months in prison. The connection he made with the civil rights movement is quite interesting, by the way, in relation to the history of the connection between race and religious freedom. We might be able to talk about later. I have a lot to say about that didn't make it into this paper. Few evangelicals in the early 80s were inclined to lend their support to new religious movements. As Philip Jenkins has described, evangelicals had traditionally criticized such groups less in the psychological terms of a secular anti-cult movement and more by attacking their theological heterodoxies. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip the details here, but I hope you'll take my word on that. By the mid-1980s, right-wing evangelical activists were rethinking the politics of religious freedom and with it, their approach to new religious movements. Despite the victory they claimed in Reagan's election, many conservative evangelicals in this period felt themselves increasingly under attack by a secular society. And anybody familiar with the history of the new religious right in this period knows this. A newsletter called The Christian Inquirer, published in Niagara Falls, New York, headlined its May 1981 issue with a piece titled "Pastor and Wife Threatened with Jail." It told the story of a Nebraska pastor, Everett Sullivan, soon to become a celebrity in evangelical circles, who refused to cooperate with state licensing requirements for the elementary school run by his church. Another article reported an IRS investigation of the Church of Christian Liberty in Brookfield, Wisconsin, and this IRS investigation then is parallel with the IRS investigations of the Scientologists and the Unification Church. They don't parallel here, but later on it becomes that, okay? For alleged non-compliance with government requirements for tax exemptions. This small church is forced to spend its energies and limited funds fighting an unelected bureaucracy that seeks to approve and license religion, the editors noted. For groups like the Moral Majority, religious freedom was becoming a key rallying cry, asserting, first of all, the right to practice and proclaim Christianity in the public sphere, and freedom from government regulation, rights that for many evangelicals also seem to slide indistinguishably into assertions of the right to legal enforcement of Christian norms. So how those things relate and what the connection is there is something I'm trying to work out. By the beginning of 1984, some right-wing evangelicals had identified congruence between their cause and the religious freedom claims of the Unification Church. And that the connection seems to be made most directly with the Unification Church, but they see it more broadly as well. This became explicit at a conference on religious freedom held in January 1984 by the Center for Judicial Studies. Center founder James McClellan, an early critic of so-called judicial activism, set the tone for the event. The assembled panelists, wrote one admiring reviewer, were quite adept at revealing how capriciously the Supreme Court has distorted the First Amendment to reflect an agnosticism totally at odds with the American Constitution. One panel at the event was titled "The Case Against the Internal Revenue Service." It addressed the case of Bob Jones University, which had just lost its tax-exempt status because of its policy against interracial dating and marriage, and of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, who was also under IRS investigation. So these are the two cases before the conference. So this conference provided a sympathetic introduction for conservative evangelicals to Moon's cause, and they would soon prove to be invaluable new allies in the Unification Church's long quest for religious legitimacy. It took advantage of the moment by contributing startup funds for the nascent Coalition for Religious Freedom, mentioned at the very beginning of my talk. That group, the Coalition for Religious Freedom, organized religious liberty rallies in cities around the country in May and June of 1984. Thousands of pastors, evangelical pastors, signed the group's religious liberty proclamation and pledged to stand in solidarity with Reverend Moon and Reverend Sullivan, the evangelical pastor in Nebraska, and to observe the second Sunday of every June as Religious Liberty Day, and to organize religious liberty committees in their churches and local communities. That summer, they helped convince a subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee, chaired by Utah Republican Orrin Hatch, to hold an oversight hearing on religious liberty. He offered an entirely different perspective on Moon than his colleagues at Dole's hearing 5 years earlier. What are we to think when a leader of an unpopular church who's generally hated and despised by large groups of people may be thrown into prison after a court refuses to recognize what some believe to be his and the church's constitutional rights, Hatch asked. Highlighting Moon's cause helped evangelicals make the case that they were not attempting to impose their own religious vision on all Americans, but were simply calling for a return to national ideas of religious freedom. The climax of that summer's event was a pageantry rally for religious freedom held in Washington, D.C. In July 1984, the rally employed a cast of over 100 actors and musicians to dramatize the history of American religious freedom. This was a big pageant, featuring a series of heroes from Roger Williams, our hero here this weekend, to James Madison, and Everett Sullivan. According to a reporter from the Washington Post, the most dramatic moment of the rally was an emotional message from the Reverend Moon's daughter. Moon himself was in prison at this time. Jin Moon related how her father had been liberated by American troops in 1950 from a concentration camp in North Korea and came to America 21 years later to do God's will and repay his gratitude to America. Now he was being imprisoned by the very country that he loved against American traditions of religious freedom. The crowd of about 4,000 people, many of them Heartland evangelicals who had come to DC for this event, waved printed placards in Moon's support and at one point broke into a prolonged chant of "Free Reverend Moon." Not everyone was happy with this turn of events. One pastor from Illinois told the Washington Post reporter that, like many of those present, he had accepted an all-expenses-paid trip to DC, finding out after his arrival that the trip was apparently paid for by the Unification Church. And then he felt a little bit used. He was not the only one upset by this affiliation. A number of the Coalition on Religious Freedom board members and the group's first president eventually left the organization because they believed it had become a mouthpiece for the Unification Church. However, it did a great deal to foreground religious freedom as a key frame for evangelical concerns, and I'm going to not tell you all the details of the activities and TV shows and newsletters that it put forth in the interest of time. But this group, the Coalition for Religious Freedom, and its affiliated and similar organizations articulated and promoted a vision of religious freedom that implicitly or explicitly privileged conservative Christianity as a necessary foundation, past and present, for American public life, at the same time that they were opposing deprogrammers and defending the rights of new religious movements because they themselves were being targeted by the anti-cult movement, and they saw the anti-cult movement as one of the tools of secular humanism against religion in America and encouraging government regulation of America, of the country. So I'm going to stop there, and sorry I ran a little over time. Thanks for your attention.